Hello, my name is Françoise Mathieu, and I'm a registered psychotherapist in the province of Ontario. I'm also the executive director of TEND. TEND is a consulting firm that provides education and training across North America to organizations that identify as being not only high stress, but also trauma exposed. During the first 10 years of my career as a mental health professional, I worked in the field and I provided counseling and employee assistance programs to high stress, trauma exposed professionals such as the military, law enforcement, correction, funeral services, paramedics, emergency workers of various kinds. I was trying to think if I've forgotten one, but you get the idea. So I was basically working with folks who are asked to be present, be on, but also be exposed to many challenges aspect of probably the worst day of a person's life. What I want to invite you to do today is spend some time with me exploring what are ways that we can navigate not only our own stressors, but also how do we support our colleagues and or our staff, and how do we deal with the natural consequences of the work that we do, which has often been referred to as compassion fatigue. So I hope you'll find this workshop interesting and relevant to the really important work that you do. So welcome. Now, I'm sure that you have been asked to attend many Zoom-based or online-based trainings over the last few years. And a lot of people have referred to this sense of fatigue that they experience when they are engaged in either online meetings or having to do some Zoom-based learning, such as this one. So I have a couple of suggestions for you that have been found to make a really big difference. The first part is what's been found that's really tiring about being on Zoom or similar platforms is actually being on camera. That's called impression management. So if you are attending a meeting and you have to have your camera on, there's a whole level of awareness you have to have, of course, about the way you're dressed or the background or what your face looks like when you're listening to someone else. So one thing is that if you don't have to be on camera, sometimes you do, turning your camera off can make a really big difference and help you actually focus on the learning. The second thing that's been found to be tiring is what is called switch tasking and hyperconnectivity. Switch tasking, which I suspect may happen to you as you're listening to this, is that you're perhaps listening to me speak about a concept and then you get a quick notification. You get a ping, you get a text, you get a call, perhaps someone comes in and asks you something. And having to switch your attention from listening to me to paying attention to that notification means that every time we're turning back to focusing on this, we are 40% less focused. It turns out that our brain is not very good at multitasking. So unless you're currently on call, which I suspect some of you may be, but the best way to take this course is to try to turn off all other notifications that are coming at you. And so when you're only focused on one thing, it turns out that attending a web-based training is not that tiring. The other thing to think about is for some of you, you don't learn best by sitting staring at a screen. I certainly know personally that I'm a big podcast listener. So I would actually much rather, for example, listen to a book than read it. I mean, I don't mind reading, but when I listen to an audiobook, I can also be in the garden, I can go for a walk, I can be cleaning my house, what have you. And I have found the same for me personally when I'm learning or taking part in an online training. Now, for some of you, if you're very visual, that's not going to work for you. But what I'm basically inviting you to do is to think about what is the best way for you to learn and take in information. And if you want to get the best out of today's training, that's what I would recommend. Do whatever works best for you and try to turn off notifications and also take breaks if it feels like, a 2-hour training all in a row doesn't work for you. That's totally fine. So I want to start by telling you a little bit about who I am and my background. You can probably already tell that I'm French Canadian. First of all, I have the Frenchest name possible. And secondly, I have an accent, which I'm sure you can hear. And I'm originally from the province of Quebec. I'll tell you more about that later. But for the last nearly 30 years now, I have lived in Kingston, Ontario. Now, if you've never been to Kingston, you may not know that while there's certain things that are very interesting about us, we're a mid-sized community, so we're about 120,000 population. And we are on the shores of Lake Ontario, right across from Watertown or Syracuse, New York. So if you're trying to situate us, we are literally just at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, and in half an hour I could be across in the US. And what you may not know is that we are the prison capital of Canada. So I lost count, but last time I checked, we have about 10 correctional facilities here, federal and provincial, probation, parole, halfway houses, kind of the whole prison industrial complex that goes with that. And I'm sure that you're listening to this and you're thinking, we're in funeral services. Why are you telling us about the prison system? Stay with me. You'll see why I'm talking about that. This picture is actually a picture of the Kingston Pen. And I took a picture, this picture on my walk. This is just 2 blocks from my home. And some of you probably know that the Kingston Penitentiary, up until when it closed nearly a decade ago now, was the oldest prison in continuous use in North America. So it was built long before Alcatraz. And I had the chance to spend some time visiting and volunteering at the Kingston Pen when I first arrived in Kingston. And what I noticed right away, and I don't know if you've been in the prison system, I suspect some of you may even have had to do some body recovery in the correctional system, or perhaps you've had another career working there, or you know people who do. It is a very toxic work environment. And when I talk with corrections, they're not even offended. They agree with me. They'll say, yeah, this is a very high stress and trauma exposed work environment. And what I found going into the Kingston Pen is that wasn't just, the physical layout, obviously aging infrastructure and, mold and darkness and kind of concerns about safety. It was also the workplace climate. Now, I'll go back to the infrastructure piece a little bit later, but what also struck me, which was really interesting, is that not every correctional officer who had been there for a long time was cynical and burnt out. Some of them were. Some of them definitely had, the retirement app that was calculating, 18 years, 2 months, 1 day till I retire. But some of the folks who had been there for a long time were actually relatively well, in spite of the challenge of the work. And I became really interested in that in a variety of professions, exploring this thing that I later found out is called career sustaining behaviors. What is it about certain folks that they can actually stay in these really challenging workplaces and stay well? And I basically started researching that. So I'm not only interested in burnout, secondary traumatic stress, and compassion fatigue, I'm really interested to learn more about why are some people well suited to certain jobs and others not. Now, some of the work I've done in funeral services, I'll talk to you a little bit about that in a few minutes, but I remember not long ago working for a coroner's office and actually for the Centre for Forensic Science of Ontario. And I remember speaking to a coroner there who said to me, we are the last responders. And I'm sure that you would identify as last responders as well. We have work in professions that are not well understood, where there are all sorts of misconceptions or, myths about what we do. But what people often don't realize is that it can also be not only a disturbing and just distressing job at time, but it can also be a job where we feel that we are sometimes caring for individuals in a way, once they have passed, that is more respectful than they were ever treated while they were alive. And so the notion of being a last responder, I think, is not well understood out in the world. And I also became really interested in having conversations with folks who work in funeral services, and I'll give you a couple of examples in a minute, to try and understand what sustained their career and what allowed them to be in that field. But what I also heard, and I don't know if you've had this experience, if you've been in the field for a long time or you're in a leadership role, I also found that sometimes some folks went into funeral services not really understanding what the work entailed. And I'll tell you a couple of stories about that in a minute. So when I think about my volunteer experience at corrections, it really was the beginning of this journey that I've been on now for 25 years of trying to understand, what are we really talking about when we're referring to high trauma, high stress exposed jobs? How are our jobs, yours and mine, different than someone maybe in your family or friend who work in a really high pressure sales environment that has nothing to do with trauma? I'm sure you'd agree with me that working as an accountant and its fiscal year end can be incredibly stressful. My brother worked for nearly 20 years at Cirque du Soleil, and he was not an acrobat. Don't imagine him in tights or anything, but he obviously had, huge deadlines and lots of workload pressures. There's something that makes us unique and makes the strategies that we need to develop very different than you're trying to stay well while working at Cirque du Soleil, if that makes sense. So you're getting an idea a little bit of the work that we do at Tend. As I said earlier, we work all over North America. We have done a lot of work in the province of Alberta, lots of work with Edmonton Police Service, particularly with homicide, major crime, child abuse, sexual assault divisions. As I said before, I've worked with the Centre for Forensic Sciences in the province of Ontario. We've done a lot of work with funeral services, particularly in the province of Ontario, big and small funeral homes. And also recently, we had the pleasure of providing a 2 years in a row program for the Humber College. So some of you probably know Humber College is based in Ontario, and it's one of the only and one of the largest funeral director programs in our province. And I had the pleasure of working with the students who were engaged in that program. And that was really interesting because, like yourselves, I'm sure, some of you, this is a family business. You've been in funeral services, or your family has, for generations. For some of you, this is a second career, and I certainly saw that when I was working at the funeral director with the class of Humber. And what we finally found is that some folks were going into this field without truly understanding what it entailed, and they may come from backgrounds where their family were not at all supportive or even understood what this work was about. And what we also found is that people who were really new to the world of funeral services, who were not well prepared and did not receive the appropriate, relevant, and well-deserved support and mentorship they needed, did not necessarily stay in the field for very long. So it's not a career that a lot of people necessarily understand. And how do we support our young rookies as they're coming into this field? And we'll talk more a little bit about that as we go on. Now, what I've also learned from working with funeral services over the years is that, and I'm going to make a generalization here, I hope you don't mind, but you all have a really excellent, a little twisted, but a really excellent sense of humor. I've never been at a workshop working with funeral services where I did not have hilariously funny encounters and conversations. I remember some years ago, right here in Kingston, there was a conference for funeral services, and the trade show was really quite entertaining. And they even had a mechanical bull, which maybe in Alberta would be completely normal at a funeral services conference. But it was my first conference in funeral services, and I was quite entertained and amused by that. But joking aside, I'm sure that if we were spending some time together right now chatting, you could probably make a whole list of all sorts of myths, misconceptions, and stereotypes that people have about the work that you do. And whether that is, promoting you to instant sainthood, I'm sure that there are times, and maybe actually don't tell people what you do for a living. I bet that's possible too. If you're on vacation, maybe you choose not to say what you do, or maybe you're really proud of it, but there are times, I'm sure, that if you tell people what you do, they're going to have a whole host of reactions, from recoil, people are very uncomfortable about anything related to death and dying, to, as I said, instant sainthood, to morbid curiosity, correct? I'm sure maybe you never saw 6 Feet Under because it felt like you were watching work. I'm not sure, but I feel like for all of its complexities, the TV show 6 Feet Under provided, even though there was a lot of humor around it, it also provided a really interesting account of that tension between running a business, having to make a living, dealing with the decisions for small funeral homes about whether to stay independent or not, the day-to-day realities of that work. And I feel like, although it was obviously not accurate representation of it, and as an aside, trust me, as a mental health professional, we are not well represented in the media. Some of you probably know there's usually, if you're watching Law and Order, SVU, there's like one social worker with stringy hair and a dirty gray cardigan who comes and takes children away. That's about it. That's about how we're represented. But there is that other side of this humor that people who don't work in our fields probably don't understand. So here's an image I found online. It's not real, obviously, it was like made up, but it was basically a Lego set for funeral directors. Obviously, this is not true, but I just found it quite hilarious. And, what I would find is that people who are not in this world probably would not think this is funny, but I hope you think it's funny. I thought it was pretty interesting. So what's the reality of the work that you do? I have a friend called Robert who recently retired from working as a funeral director here in our community. And I'm smiling because he is such a lovely human being. And I used to see him regularly. We'd go to the gym together. And he said to me, a lot of people don't understand that, especially in a small community, I have no anonymity, right? He is Robert, the funeral director, wherever he goes, because people know him. And he said, I also have to run a business, make a living, train staff, retain staff, deal with grieving families and loved ones, help them prepare and also sell them, like a package and so on. And he said, it's like such a complex combination, but what people often don't know, and I know now I'm preaching to the choir because you know this better than me, but he also talked about working 24/7 and having to get up at 3 a.m. and go and attend, to a situation, or having to deal with some really challenging stories. And when we work in small communities, we, of course, often know who those people are. I was recently in Prince Edward Island, and I was working with the fire marshal, and he said to me, of course, he said, when I get a call to a bad scene, I know those people, right? These are my neighbors. So I don't know what you would add here when you think about the challenges and the reality and the rewards, of course, of your work, but whether that's working with the families of the deceased, with all of the complexity that sometimes entails. I was a couples therapist for 10 years, and I got to see the whole landscape of what happens with families when they are grieving. Exposure, of course, to difficult stories. I also worked as a hospice volunteer, and as I'm sure you would know, and you would agree with me, some people had good deaths and some people did not, and the impact of those stories. Exposure to traumatic deaths. And what many of you have talked about is dealing with, premature or unexpected deaths. So deaths of kiddos, deaths of children, death by suicide, just tragic circumstances. And there's some interesting research that has found that as first responders and last responders, what often impacts us the most are in rank, so death of children, death of someone in our area, in our field. So for example, having to attend to a scene and it's a first responder or someone that you know. Those are the ones that are found to increase our level of distress. And finally, attending to a death of someone who reminds us of someone who we really care about. It's also about community expectations. And there's this funny kind of combination, right? Where, as Robert said, you are expected to, basically be the local kind of community source of comfort or leadership, but you also have to run a business. And having that pushback and perhaps conflict sometimes where families who can't afford certain things might come to you and say, how dare you charge this much? And as a weird aside, a profession that runs into that a lot are veterinarians. As I'm sure you know, and you may yourself know some veterinarians, they have to run a business, and very few people have insurance for pet insurance or what have you. And so there's so many times where they're saying, your pet needs something really expensive. Let's pretend, I don't know, kidney dialysis. And someone will say, well, I can't afford that. And then they will lash out at the veterinarian for not being willing to give that dialysis for less money or for free. And at the end of the day, the veterinarian obviously can't do that, just like you can't do that either. We've already talked about irregular schedules. Sometimes being the lightning rod for anger or hostility of grieving families and friends. And the thing I think we don't talk about often enough is the repetitive nature of the work. Now, as I said, I've been in the field for almost 30 years, and I'm not going to lie to you and say that by the 400th soldier in crisis I had seen, that I was as attuned or as impacted as the first time I spoke to a soldier who had just come back from combat. It is normal that there's a certain amount of erosion not necessarily numbing, but maybe I would call it desensitization that we develop. And I'll talk a little bit later about how do we find the sweet spot between feeling nothing and feeling too much. But inevitably, there are certain things that will become more routine, of course, because this is what we do. And we'll explore that a little bit further. And finally, as I said, running a business. So the way I want to talk about this today is kind of in 5 little buckets. The first one, as a trauma expert, I want to talk a little bit about what are the impacts that we have found in the literature. And I've written and collaborated on much research on this topic. What's the impact of hearing, seeing, and reading about death and loss daily? How do we explore our own personal risk factors? How do we stay well when bearing witness to suffering and also remain compassionate? What are some strategies that I can recommend so that we can try to recalibrate and reset? And what are some resources to go further? So in the interest of time, I won't spend a lot of time on tools to reset and recalibrate. We're going to provide additional resources for that. And you'll see that there's a lot more that you can go and learn about. And these are mostly 2 to 3 minute strategies. So they're very easy, they're free. So I'll mention a few, but in the interest of time, I want to make sure that we kind of talk about the framework so that we understand what's going on for us and where we can start. You're going to see that we've provided you with a digital handout as well as 2 ebooks. And if you want to get the most out of this course, I really want to encourage you to have your digital workbook alongside, kind of open next to this. And you're going to see at various points, there will be some exercises that I'm going to invite you to do. And I would encourage you to either pause during this webinar and go and complete those, or at the end to follow up. And you'll see particularly that these 2 books, so I wrote the Compassion Fatigue Workbook some time ago, 2012, and my colleague Pat Fisher wrote the wonderful Resilience, Balance, and Meaning book that I highly recommend. As an aside, both of those books are really perfect if you are in a leadership role and want to use them with your staff. You're going to see that they are very short chapters. There's some questionnaires, some activities that you can do on your own or as a team. But you'll see in your digital workbook that there are certain chapters that we've identified in both of these books where you can go further. And I encourage you to do that if, as I said, you want to continue to get the most out of this course. So let's think a little bit about this. How does this work impact you? How long have you been in the field? Are you new? You're kind of like mid-career, or you're towards the end of your career? And how does that impact vary over time? Does it ebb and flow? First of all, I want to invite you to think about how this work impacts you at home. So I don't know who's in your life, but I certainly know that my family, so I have 2 kids and who are now adults, and they both have told me that living with a parent who is a trauma specialist has good sides, but also it has negative sides. And part of what I know is that over time, I either overshared information about the dangers of the world to them, or that I would be quite desensitized to certain things that they or their friends found distressing or alarming, because I'd seen so many situations that were similar to that. And I invite you to think about when you're at home. So I'm not talking about work right now, but let's pretend something happens at home that's a crisis. I'm going to invite you to think of your own examples. And I'm not saying to think about the most disturbing thing you've ever experienced, but I'll give you one quick example. So a few years ago, and he turned out to be fine, but a few years ago, my son fainted. He'd had the flu and he was dehydrated and whatnot. And he fainted and he smashed his face quite badly. He's fine, but you know, it was not a pretty sight. And we had to call paramedics and so on and so forth. And what was really interesting is that my partner and I reacted very, very differently. So my partner is not in this field. He's a neuroscientist, and he's a very sweet man of Irish heritage. And I'm not only mentioning that because he's very emotional, and like he cries when you hear any beautiful song, and like he's just like got a very sweet, sensitive soul. And he reacted probably like a normal parent, which was to be extremely agitated around this, right? So my son had fallen, there was blood everywhere. and he was in shock, my son, maybe my husband too. And what was really interesting is I became incredibly calm. And I became very focused on what we needed to do next. And I even found my blood pressure like just lowering, right? Just like fully focused, because partly that's my training. And I'm sure it's your case as well. Now, there are times where that's how we react, and that might be good. And I'll go back to that in a few minutes, but that's not always the case. I know that there's certain times, because of my nearly 30 years in the field, that I know too much. And so I sometimes start thinking about the worst case scenario. That's not usually when the crisis is happening in front of me. It's more hypothetical, so my kid would go on a canoe and camping trip, and I would immediately think about all the possible terrible things that might happen during the trip. And I couldn't relax until he had come back. So there's no right answer to this, but I want to invite you to think about what is your own kind of pattern of responses, and how do your loved ones feel about that? So the taking care of business mode that I'm referring to earlier, if that's what happens to you, and I certainly know that's what happened to me that time when my son fainted, I just became like, well, let's case manage this, right? We're going to talk to the paramedics. We're going to see what's going on. And by the time the paramedics arrived, I was truly incredibly calm, and in a way that was helpful in the moment, but it's also a way of avoiding, correct? It's a way of feeling nothing. And that might be good in the moment, but part of what I'm really interested to explore with you is that what if that becomes our way of coping all the time? What is the potential impact of that? Now, I'm going to actually go in other fields and kind of delve into some research from them so that we can learn and expand, what we know. And there's a really excellent book that some of you may have heard of called Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement. And it was written by Kevin Gilmartin, who is not only a psychologist, but he's a former Marine and former police officer. And this book, which was actually given to me by a member of the RCMP in Alberta, actually. There you go. And he told me that this was a book that was being offered to rookies when they start, when they finish, when they start working the RCMP. And I really like this book. And if you haven't seen it, I would actually recommend that you check it out. You can easily substitute the examples they give for, examples in the funeral services. And it talks about the impact on our families and loved ones. Like, basically, what is it like to be in a relationship or friendship with you? And what are the ways that we can talk about the impact of this work? And what I really like is it doesn't only focus on PTSD. In fact, it's not a book about post-traumatic stress disorder. It's a book about everything else. And we'll talk more about PTSD in a few minutes, but it's a book that helps us explore what are our transition rituals? What is it like to come home after a challenging day? And in it, he has a saying. He refers to what we call the magic chair. And I don't know if you have a magic chair at home. The magic chair is the chair where, we finally get home, we take off our, work outfits, our suits and whatnot, and all the blood drains from our brain and maybe goes into the remote or into our phones and what have you, and we just tune out. And I don't know about you, but there are times where that is exactly what I need. I've been on the road quite a bit as I'm recording this. I've been on the road for nearly 2 months now. And after I've taught an all-day training, there's nothing left. I've left it all on the dance floor. And I really sometimes just don't feel like chatting to anybody or socializing, and I just want to chill. And I might end up watching Netflix for longer than I should. And, if you're doing that once in a while, it's probably just fine. But what if that's every day? What is that like for people around you? What is it like for you, for your nervous system? And we start seeing sometimes that we go into that kind of numbing or avoidance mode. And if that's happening all the time, Kevin Gilmartin talks a little bit about that in his book, and what are ways that we can think about having a transition ritual. Are there some ways for us to do that, perhaps for a few minutes, but not for 5 hours, if that makes sense? So I'm going to invite you to pause now and think about, can you relate to that example? Now, some magic chairs are more, are healthier than others. I'm sure you'd agree with me that coming home, taking off your suit, and going for a long walk with your dog is probably a much healthier way to kind of deal with that work transition than spending, 2 hours on TikTok or playing a video games. And as I said, 20 minutes, 30 minutes of that, no problem. But if that's what's happening every single night, And we know that there are lots of ways to numb out, using alcohol, drugs, food, gambling. I mean, these are all ways where our nervous system is so taxed, so maxed out that we kind of disconnect in that way. So just inviting at this point for you to have curiosity around that. The other thing that was really interesting, and I started reading about this in the work of a colleague called Eric Gentry, who's a psychologist who explores kind of all these topics related to compassion, fatigue, and trauma, is what he referred to as the zealot phase. And the zealot phase is a phase where you are taking on all the challenges. You're doing overtime, you're taking all the calls, you're like, I got this. And you might be doing that in your personal life as well. What we have found about the zealot phase is it often happens earlier in our career. And this isn't the same as overwork because there's no one else to do the job. This is basically, and I want to invite you to think now, if you can think of someone, even maybe yourself, who was in that phase at some point, just saying yes to everything all the time. And what we have found is that although these people to the outside world look extremely functional, like superhuman, they're actually really close to burning out. And it turns out that they have a really hard time saying no, and everything looks universally urgent. And that becomes really tricky when, I don't know if that's your case, because I bet some of you live in larger communities, but those of you who live in more isolated communities, maybe you can't say no because there's no one else to do the job. But it starts to be a warning sign when we literally cannot set limits and we're doing all the things. And maybe we're doing them at home, we're volunteering, we're coaching, a sports team, like we're just doing all the things all the time. And not only that can set us up for burnout, but there are times where that's actually a sign of avoidance. So we're avoiding through overwork, if that makes sense. So I want to give you an example from the field of paramedic services. So I read this book a couple of years ago. I'm not sure if you've read it. It's called 1,000 Naked Strangers by Kevin Hazard. And he's originally from Philadelphia. And just as an aside, this book is not suitable for general population reading. I don't think you would be particularly disturbed by the stories he shares. They're very graphic. These are stories where you would have been called to obviously do body recovery at some point. So they're, pretty gruesome. But he's not disrespectful to individuals in the story, but he just talks about what it was like for him to work as a paramedic for 10 years in Philadelphia. And you can see the title, 1,000 Naked Strangers, where at some point they all started to blur and look like, they were just one person. And in it, he talked about a couple of things that led him to decide to leave the field. And some of you, if you know paramedics, which I'm sure you do, a lot of folks find that 10 years is kind of like that sweet spot where a lot of people leave after a decade, and it's probably a good decision. And people who stay either find different ways to stay well, or they're just not well and they're staying in the field. So I want to share a couple of quotes from Kevin's book. He said, early on in EMT school, my instructor told us that nerves were to be expected. We should expect some excitement and maybe a little dread, and that while we were on scene and in the ambulance afterwards, when the patient was no longer in our care, we should expect the adrenaline, the fast heart rate, the hyperfocus. That feeling, he said, was what would keep us from making mistakes. It would keep us zeroed in. When it went, we should too. And I invite you to think about that. And I am sure that if you're not new to the field, I'm sure that you do not have an adrenaline rush when you get a call compared to when when you started out. And I can tell you that, of course, as a crisis worker, I used to do suicide assessments. And of course, the first time I did that, I was appropriately nervous, because I think we should be nervous when we don't know what we're doing or it's our first time. And by the 400th one, I wasn't. But if I got to a place by the 400th one where I was so disconnected, desensitized, eating a sandwich, not feeling anything, making disrespectful jokes about the person, the deceased or whatever, then we've obviously lost it, right? So how do we find that sweet spot between caring too much and not caring at all? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Okay, so we're starting to recommend some resources here. I've done a lot of writing on this topic, and you can access on our toolkit an article called Coming Home to Secondary Traumatic Stress. This is an article I wrote a few years ago where I had a very honest conversation with my partner. We have been together for over 30 years now, about what is it like to be married to someone who works in this field. And if you're in a relationship, maybe you're in the same business. And I want to invite you to think what that's like. Do you talk shop at night or not at all? If perhaps you're in a relationship with someone who's not in this field at all, as I am, and what is that like? Or perhaps you are not in a relationship and that's not by choice. And then I want to invite you to think about who are the folks that you go to. And if you're single, and maybe it's your choice to be single, do you have a community of support? Right? Who do you go to talk about this? And do they understand the impacts of this work? Okay, so let's talk more about that. What is the sweet spot between caring too much and not at all? So I actually gave a TEDx talk about this a few years ago, and I actually really do invite you to consider going to watch it. You can even pause this now and go and watch it now. And it was at Queen's University in Kingston, and the intended audience was really general population. So I was invited to give a talk that was relevant for university students, but also all of their families and loved ones. And what I have been told is that this talk is a really good way to introduce folks to the basics of what I'm here to talk to you about today. It's only 16 minutes long. So if you have family or friends or even new staff where you want to offer them a free, like just a 16-minute primer on everything I'm going to talk about today, show them this TED Talk. And what I talk about in there is, what is that difference between caring, like what is the difference between like just caring just the right amount and caring too much? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later today, but it's really thinking about, first of all, noticing it in ourselves and what are the risks of each extreme and how do we kind of recalibrate so that we can stay in that middle part. So we'll get back to that. The other thing I've encountered, because I've worked, as I said, with so many first and last responders during my career, is that there's this atmosphere of stoicism that's, prized, that somehow stiff upper lip or being, very unemotional in the face of what we see, and also stigma around vulnerability. So I'm sure, and maybe you've heard it in your own field, maybe you've even said it, suck it up, buttercup. You can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen. In law enforcement recently, I heard this language called calling in sad, calling in mad. So just to make the distinction, we all know what calling in sick looks like. Someone's ill and they're calling in sick. Calling in mad is a term that's used to say that workers are frustrated with a working condition or some decision that was made, and they're calling in sick, but they're actually really angry about an organizational change. And calling in sad is almost always used disrespectfully to make light of or stigmatize people who are calling in sick for mental health reasons. Now, I've never understood that because, if I had the flu, you would understand. If I broke my leg, you would understand that I can't come into work. What is wrong with also saying I need a day off because I have seen or heard something really difficult, or I'm going through something, really challenging at home? And what I know is that when we do better prevention and we don't wait until people are on stress leave, it's far less expensive to give people a little bit of time off rather than having them go on extended long-term disability or short-term disability. But in our workplaces, we have to think a lot about the workplace culture and the language we use around that. Now, I'm not suggesting that law enforcement is necessarily doing a great job with this, but I'm going to tell you right now that Edmonton Police in particular, I've been really impressed with the language they're using around the importance of what they call getting a checkup from the neck up, right? So we all know about the importance of a physical, but what they're really emphasizing now is the importance of also going to counseling, going to find a good quality therapist who understands what it's like to work in your field so that they're not shocked by what you have to tell them. And language matters. And if we, even if we're uncomfortable around anything related to mental health counseling or, mental illness, When we make jokes around that, we are inadvertently contributing to stigma in the workplace. So I just want to invite you to think about some of the language that is being used, perhaps in your workplace, and are we contributing to that inadvertently or deliberately? The other thing that we know is that a lot of us, and I'm guilty of that, we tend to just say we're fine, even when we're not. That's kind of what society expects us to say, right? Hey, how are you? Good. How was your weekend? Great. I'm fine. But also thinking about what does that do and what is the impact of accumulating all of these stressors and never talking about it. Now, as you're listening to this, you might not be someone who likes to verbalize how you're feeling. It might be that when you're stressed, what you need is to be by yourself, which is perfectly fine. Or what you need is to go exercise, or what you need is to go hunting or fishing or gardening or whatever it is that works for you. But do you have certain folks in your life who you can truly go to and say, like, actually, I'm not doing well, like I'm not okay? Because what we know is that social support is one of the most important protective factors to addressing work-related stress. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. So I want to talk about some free resources that are available. These are Canadian resources and they're free. And some of you may be familiar with CIPCERT. So CIPCERT is the Canadian Institute for Public Safety Research and Treatment. And CIPCERT has been doing work with first responders, but also with funeral service professionals, law enforcement, so on and so forth. And their website has a host of free resources that are highly relevant in terms of addressing mental health, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and related factors. And they've offered on their website a screening tool that, or a series of screening tools I want to mention. And these are anonymous, they're online, they're free. And they're really aimed at looking at mood disorders, anxiety disorders, or PTSD. They are not intended to provide a clinical diagnosis, but more for you to have a bit of an assessment of, where you range and how do you compare to other first responders in the field. So you will see when you go there that they have these screeners, one for anxiety, depression, insomnia, depression, anxiety, and stress, post-traumatic stress disorder, panic disorder, risky alcohol use, and social anxiety disorder. So as I said, this is a screening tool not to be used in substitution of seeing a healthcare professional, but they can give you a bit of a range and a bit of a sense of how you compare to other people in your field. I often say that the personal influences the professional. What do I mean by that? So this is a reflection activity I'm going to invite you to do. This is private. You don't have to share this with anyone else, but I want to invite you to think about what messages you received when you were growing up from whoever raised you about self-care, about work-life balance, about taking time off. So let me give you an example. So first of all, I could lie to you and tell you that this is an adorable photo of me in the Arctic. It is actually my older brother, Cirque du Soleil, because I'm a second child. So there are no photos of me. I'm just kidding, but that one was pretty darn adorable. And we spent the first decade of our lives in the Arctic. So my parents were teachers for what became Katovitz School Board, and we lived in 3 villages. I particularly remember living in Puvornituk, which is the red dot on the left, and Kuujjuaq, and which was a much larger Inuit community. And I spent, as I said, the first years of my life in the Arctic. So there are lots of powerful messages that I learned from living in communities that have been deeply impacted by the impact of residential schools, multi-generational trauma, colonization, all of those impacts. It was also a beautiful, lovely community, and it was a wonderful place to grow up. We were incredibly free to roam and do all sorts of shenanigans. But here's the thing. I was raised by parents who are now still alive, and they're in their early 80s. So they would have been born in 1941, give or take. So they were part of a certain generation that has been called the silent generation. So if you think about that, and you may know people who were born and raised during the 50s, they grew up in the middle of they were born in the middle of the Second World War. They were raised by people who had gone through the Depression. They grew up during the Red Scare and during the whole conversation about the Cold War, and so on and so forth. And so they have certain types of values and messages that they passed on to me due to that, right, where they're from. My father came from urban poverty. So he grew up near the Montreal, the Olympic Stadium in Montreal. It wasn't built at the time, obviously. And he grew up in a family that had very little. His dad was a steel mill worker. His mom died of cancer. And my father learned very young that, in fact, I remember he said to me that at age 12, my grandfather introduced him to smoking because, quote unquote, that made you a man, right? So it won't surprise you to know that my dad ended up with emphysema, right? Because he started smoking at age 12. But the messages I received from him is like, you work until you die and then you work some more. There was no notion about work-life balance. What's that? And my father, because of his background, developed an incredible fear of debt, right? So even though he became a school principal and then a superintendent, my dad was allergic to any form of debt. And that might be a good lesson. And this is not a judgment, but I want to invite you to think about that, right? What are the messages you received? And what I know, and I've talked with my brother about this, I've written about this as well, is that what my brother and I really struggle with is taking a break. Because we have all of this. My parents were also Catholics. They left the church before I was born. They had very complicated feelings about the Quebec church, so they had all of this baggage. And so it's like I inherited kind of this lapsed Catholic guilt because the guilt somehow follows you. And these kind of messages about being afraid of poverty and so on and so forth. So I want to invite you to think about that for yourself. What are the messages that you receive about work-life balance and about self-care? And my parents gave me lots of other wonderful messages, but I certainly know that that's something I continue to work with, is feeling guilty if I take half a day off, or the messages that you have to show something, right? You have to produce something. And the powerful messages that are positive are about being of service, giving back to your community. But how do you find that balance? And what I think is the first step is to reflect on that and to do some thinking about whether we embrace those messages or maybe we reacted against them. And of course, I'm talking like a therapist now because I am one. And sometimes that's what we do in therapy, is go and work through some of that stuff when it's not serving us well. Okay, now we're going to move I've been throwing a lot of terminology around. I want to move to talking about these terms that I've been saying: compassion fatigue, secondary trauma, PTSD. I want to talk a little bit about where do they come from and how do we identify what's going on for us. So I promise I'm going to make this interesting and short. I'm not going to give you a whole academic course on the whole history of this, although I completely could because I love this stuff, but I won't. But just simply put, as I'm recording this, we are nearing the 30th anniversary of the creation of the field of compassion fatigue and secondary traumatic stress. So it started in the 90s. And one of the pivotal books that was written on the topic was by Dr. Charles Figley, who's a psychologist. And what he was doing is he was working with Vietnam veterans. And he was finding that a lot of the psychologists and therapists who were working with Vietnam vets were developing what looked like secondary trauma. So they hadn't been in Vietnam. They hadn't been there in the killing fields. They hadn't directly experienced this. And yet these stories were hitching a ride with them. What they also found, Charles and his team, is that there seemed to be this erosion of caring that I've referred to earlier, where sometimes it felt like you had seen such a large volume of similar cases that you no longer felt present. And so they started kind of toying around with that terminology in the 1990s. What's interesting is some of the first groups that were studied, and I'm sure some of this won't surprise you. One of the first group that was studied was anyone who worked in child welfare. To this day, anyone who works in child protection, child abuse, child welfare, child protection, child abuse, internet crimes against children, anything to do with supporting and helping kids who have been abused and or neglected or harmed, is the most studied group of all. So if you want really good data, they are the most studied group for obvious reasons. The second group that was studied were cancer care nurses, particularly pediatric cancer care nurses. The very first study was done in Florida in the 90s, and it was found that pediatric oncology nurses had one of the highest rate of emotional distress compared to other nurses, which again, I think surprises no one. A group that may surprise you, that was one of the first groups studied, were people working in the animal care community. Some of you may know the very sad statistic that veterinarians have one of the highest suicide rates of any profession. And animal care workers, so animal shelter workers, vet techs, are often folks who have their own history of childhood adversity. And it makes sense when you think about it. If you're mistreated by humans, you are naturally going to be drawn to caring and spending time with animals. However, and if you're a veterinarian, as we know, that's a very difficult profession to get into. And so they're very perfectionistic, A-type. They end up with massive student debt. And then what do? They're not all just seeing, happy kittens and puppies all the time, as you know. And so they're exposed to a lot of distressing situations, animals being harmed, feeling helpless, not being able to help them, neglect, abandonment, what have you. And again, they're dealing with dysregulated customers who are very angry because, as I said earlier, their loved, animal cannot receive the care that they deserve. And so it's kind of the perfect storm for a high stress, trauma exposed profession. So I've been talking about compassion fatigue. There was actually a terminological change coming up. So I just wanted to tell you why we're moving away from that term. It's totally fine if you use it. It's not being canceled, like it's not a slur, but it turns out that compassion fatigue is not quite the correct term. So I'm going to explain that now so that this actually becomes a strategy that we can use. The preferred term is actually empathic strain. You're going to hear compassion fatigue. It's being used widely. As I said, it's been used for 30 years, so we can't really undo that. But it turns out that the more accurate term is empathic strain. And I'll explain in a minute why that matters. So this is really thinking about that profound emotional and physical exhaustion that can develop over the course of your career. And I talked about that earlier, kind of that gradual erosion of just not feeling as connected, whether that's at work or at home, or maybe both. It was actually the Canadian veterinarian community that started writing about moving away from that term first. Remember, I was saying earlier that they have been involved in this field for a very long time and have a lot of concerns about veterinarian mental health. And the way to think about why we're using empathic strain as well is that it turns out that it's not tiring to extend compassion to others. Let me give you an example of that. I don't know if you have children in your lives, whether they are your own or someone else's. Maybe you're a parent, an auntie, an uncle, or your best friend have kids in their lives. So imagine whatever scenario works for you. If you have children in your lives and you have more than one, I want to invite you to think about when the second one was about to arrive in this world. Did you have a moment of hesitation thinking, can I actually love this second child as much as I love the first one? Think about that for a minute. I'm going to be honest with you, like I did just for a millisecond when I had my son. So my daughter was first and I absolutely adored her. And then when my son was about to show up, I was like, can I possibly love another child as much as I love this little girl? And it turns out, of course I could. And it turns out that I'm not exhausted by loving them. I might be frustrated with them at various times. We might, get into some conflict, like normal frustration of relationships, but I'm not exhausted by loving them. Love is not a tiring emotion, nor is compassion. If you don't have children in your lives, maybe you have furry friends. And during the pandemic, my daughter got a kitten. He was a barn cat, he'd been abandoned there. And it's ridiculous. Like we completely fell in love with this little fur ball. I'd never had a cat before. I didn't even know really their story. And as you know, if you love animals, it turns out that when a cat chooses you and puts their little paws on you and they decide they're going to fall asleep and have a nap on your lap, you cancel all your plans. And if you have a dog that's, like kind of puts their sweet little chin on your lap and stares at like you are completely, you melt. And it turns out that you are not fatigued by loving those fur balls. Does that make sense? So compassion is not tiring. What's tiring is actually empathy. So let's talk a little bit more about that. And if you want to have the more academic conversation about this, I'm going to invite you to go to your toolkit. And my colleagues and I recorded, it's about 45-minute conversation about how this all began. Brian Bride, who you see here featured, was actually in the lab with Charles Figley when they started kind of crafting this terminology. And my colleague Ginny Sprang and Diana Tickes will talk about why we need to shift that term and what are strategies we can use to address empathic strain. So the way to think about it is basically empathy is feeling with, and compassion is actually thinking about how we can help. Now, you cannot experience compassion if you don't have empathy. Does that make sense? Let me show you what this looks like. So this is a chart that was created to kind of talk a little bit about the difference between these four concepts. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on pity and sympathy in the interest of time, but the way to think about it, if you're looking at your XY axis, so your horizontal axis is your understanding of other people's experiences from less to more. And your Y-axis, your vertical axis, is your willingness to act to support someone. So we all know what pity looks like, right? Pity would be literally stepping over someone who's like on the ground on a sidewalk. I feel sorry for you. That would be pity. I don't understand your experience and I'm not willing to help. Then we have sympathy, and then we have empathy. And empathy refers to feeling with. Now, a really good way to think about feeling with is thinking about in your own personal life. Have you ever had, you can think about it at work as well. Have you ever had someone who was describing something very distressing to you and you truly felt it in your heart? Like you actually felt their pain. Do you know what I'm talking about? I can use a very simple example, very benign example, but recently my daughter was very distraught about something that was happening to her physically. She had some physical ailment, and I literally felt the pain in my, like she was having gut issues and I felt it in my gut, right? I was feeling it with her. It was activating my pain receptors. The problem with that is, of course, if we stay in empathy, that can be very fatiguing. And what the research has shown, and I'll suggest a strategy in a minute, is that moving to compassion. So compassion is actually, how can I help? So yes, I have empathy, I feel your pain, but how do I move to the notion of being present, listening, instead of having that person's pain hitch a ride with us? Easier said than done, of course, but it turns out that it's empathy that's draining, not compassion. In fact, compassion is a verb, right? Compassion is basically, how can I provide support? And when I say, how can I help, it doesn't necessarily mean a material good. It doesn't necessarily mean that we can fix the situation for people or even give them anything, but just being present can make a really big difference, and kind of paying attention to our own nervous system when we are sitting and being present to the other person's suffering. So there's some really interesting research around this. Buddhist monks were studied a few years ago. So here, simply put, I'm going to kind of minimize the details of this study in the interest of time, but you'll get kind of the gist of it. What they did is they took Buddhist monks who are considered, as you know, expert meditators. So they have tens of thousands of hours of meditation under their belt, 10,000 to 25,000 hours on average, these expert meditators. And then they took a control group of ordinary citizens. And with their permission, both of these groups were put in a scanner, an fMRI scanner, a brain scanner, and they were shown disturbing videos of torture. No, thank you. By the way, I'm not interested in volunteering for that. Bless their hearts. So what they found was really interesting. So when they looked at the brain scan activity, the ordinary citizen had a lot of activation in the blue circles that you see on the slide here in their empathy for pain network. So that's the feeling where I feel the individual's pain and it's activating my pain receptors, right? So that was the general population, except for 1% were sociopaths who did not actually experience that, but that's for another conversation, another day. With the Buddhist monks, the expert meditators, what they found is that they did not have a lot of activation in their empathy for pain network. So in the Buddhist monks, you wouldn't see those blue dots light up at all. What they saw instead is a huge amount of activation in what is called a compassion network. So they went to the Buddhist monks and they said, what did you do in that scanner? Like while we were showing you these disturbing images, what were you doing? And that every single one of them said, oh, I practiced loving kindness meditation. I'm going to explain what that is in a minute. But at first, the scientists kind of thought, well, yeah, the Buddhist monks went to their happy place. They just meditated and they kind of zoned out during the exposure. But it turns out that's not what the Buddhist monks did. What the Buddhist monks did, which is called loving kindness meditation, is referred to as compassion training. Now, Barbara Fredrickson, who's at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, has done several studies that have found that compassion training, and I'll explain what it is in a minute, when you do it several days in a row, in fact, for several weeks, they've been found like 3 weeks, like 21 days in a row, can actually have a beneficial impact on our own feelings of positive emotions, but also feeling like we are less judgmental or reactive to another person. Now, I'm going to tell you right now that when I first heard about this, I was extremely skeptical. It's called loving kindness meditation. I'll describe what it is in a second. You can actually look it up if you're curious to hear a very simple version of it. It's only 15 minutes on this website, Greater Good in Action. It's absolutely free. And at first, I was a little bit skeptical. I'm a pretty data-driven, evidence-based person. I'm kind of like, show me the data and I'll believe it. I'm not very crunchy granola woo-woo, and no disrespect to people who are, but I don't know. It just doesn't really resonate with me. And I remember years ago, when I was just learning about all of these concepts, I was actually in California. Speaking of crunchy granola, woo-woo, I was in California and I went to a workshop and they said to me, turn to the person next to you and tell them that you deeply appreciate them. And I was like, I've never met this guy. Like, that is not my comfort zone. So what I know, though, is what I realized, particularly during the pandemic, when things were so amplified and there was so much going on and so much stress, is that there's certain strategies that really worked well for me. So one of them was simply mindfully washing my hands, right? I don't know about you, but I tend to be someone who's thinking about the next thing I have to do, but also kind of ruminating and grinding the past. So often what I'd be doing is washing my hands thinking, oh, I'm really annoyed at this person. Did I take the chicken out of the freezer? What do I do? And I decided to start simply trying to wash my hands while thinking about the hot water and the soap for 2 minutes or however long we're supposed to wash our hands. You know what I mean? And what I found is that the first day that felt unnatural. The second day I was like, oh, right, just think about the soap. And the third day that became even more, easy. And what we found, as the data showed, by Barbara Fredrickson, is after doing that for 21 days, I didn't have to try anymore. Every time I'd wash my hands, I would just fall back just thinking about the present moment for 2 minutes. It's a muscle we can develop. Loving kindness is the same. Loving kindness refers to, it's been called also the metta prayer in the Buddhist tradition, and it is sending warm wishes or loving kind wishes to another person. And it goes like this. May you be well. May you be safe. May you be loved. May I be well. May I be safe. May I be loved. And I don't know about you, but I can wish most people those 3 things. Like, I think we all have a right to have a couple of people in the world. We're like, not you, but think about it for a minute. Could you send, loving kindness messages like, may you be well, may you be safe, may you be loved to someone who cuts you off in traffic? I probably could. Right? What about a client family that's like very agitated or even yelling? Could you send them warm wishes? I could. Doesn't mean that I accept their behavior, but I could do that. And what we have found, and this is what that research study found as well, is that when you do that for 21 days in a row, it actually, we think, I'm not a neuroscientist, but we think it might be stimulating a part of the brain called the insula, which develops self-awareness. And what I know it does for me is that it just allows me a moment of pause. Just a moment of pause instead of being reactive. So I get that crappy text or that crappy email, and I have a couple of choices. One of them I can choose to fight. I can be like, oh yeah, let's go, and I reply. Or I can just take a moment and be like, may you be well, may you be safe, may you be loved. Same for me. Let's think about how I want to reply to that. So this is how you can move from empathy to compassion. And remember, compassion is not draining. So I've written about this. If you're someone who likes to kind of read some articles, it's again available for you. Now let's think a little bit about what's unique about this work that we do. I've been talking a lot about, high stress, trauma exposed work environments. What is different about the work that you do and working at Cirque du Soleil? So the difference is this, and this comes from the work of our colleague, Dr. Pat Fisher, is that not every, but many workplaces have what we call systemic workplace stress. I want to invite you to think about a part-time job that you may have done back in high school or college. I suspect, because I've met hundreds of thousands of people now and teaching these workshops, every time I get long lists of things people did. Tedious jobs, unsafe jobs, boring jobs, smelly jobs, dirty jobs. I mean, a whole bunch, right? And a lot of people say they worked in the service industry, for example. And unfortunately, they had a lot of, verbal abuse or feeling harassed. So lots of jobs can have systemic workplace stress, whether that's job stress, burnout, or workplace harassment. But what's really unique about the work that you and I do is that we are exposed to traumatic workplace stress. And traumatic workplace stress involves direct exposure to trauma. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Indirect exposure, and those two things combined can amplify our reactivity to stressful situations. And what we know is that systemic workplace stress combined with traumatic exposure amplifies our reactivity to stressors that might seem quite benign in other work environments. Now, the reality is that everyone in your workplace is impacted. This is not just for your funeral directors. This is actually about anyone who is there, whether they are custodian staff, whether they're the front of the house, whether they answer the phones, whether they reply to email. And what we have found in lots of different areas, and the images I'm showing you here are people who work for the Department of Social Services. They are being exposed to lots of different levels of dysregulated citizens, if that makes sense. And although they might not be obviously as exposed to trauma as a first responder or yourselves, they are still working in a trauma-exposed environment. It's in the ventilation system, which is the way to think about it. So every workplace has two parts to their workplace. They have their organizational structure. And I referred to that when I started. Remember, I was talking about the Kingston Penitentiary. And obviously, there was all sorts of issues that had to do with the actual physical structure. Like this is like a horse, right? The organizational structure is the skeleton of your organization. So you go back to the Kingston Pen, there was literally their physical plant, whether it was an aging infrastructure. They had legislative mandate. They had job classification, policies and procedures. They had resources. They had financial elements. And that's true, of course, for your business as well. But what animates that skeleton? What animates that is the complex living system that animates the skeleton, which is humans. And that's our own psychology and physiology and everyone who works in your workplace. That's who animates the skeleton of the organization. So this is a model that I won't spend a lot of time on today. It was developed by our colleague, Pat Fisher. But what I wanted to focus on briefly are the three foundation elements. And what we know is that a lot of workplaces, instead of ensuring that their three foundation elements are in good shape, leadership, succession planning, and employee health and wellness, they often start by focusing on things like rewards and recognition. So even though perhaps, your leadership structure is not doing great, or you have a lot of brand new people, or there's a lot of people who are stressed out or even on leave, and then we send everyone, I don't know, like some smile cookies or, a piece of paper that says, yay, everybody, like, good job. I mean, I saw so much of that during the pandemic. And it turns out, of course, is that if your foundation elements are not in good shape, those rewards are really going to fall flat. I've also seen that with team building activities. I was recently at an event where they were very stressed out. Staff were very frustrated with some of the recent changes that had happened. But they wanted to have, the organizers said they wanted to have like a fun team building afternoon. And the vibe wasn't there. Like people weren't feeling trust. They weren't necessarily feeling like they were being heard. And it was a well-meaning intervention, but what we sometimes call that in our field is spray and pray. Spray and pray is throwing wellness at staff in the hope that it's going to stick without actually addressing the foundational elements. So let's spend a couple of minutes now understanding that. What do I mean by the foundation factors? The foundation factors are critical and they're mutually interactive. And what I mean by that, and what we often say in our work, is that leaders are people too. And they are often the most stressed out members of an organization. It turns out, and I don't know if it's true for you, but very few of us who are in leadership roles actually received formal training in leadership and HR. We kind of learned, by being thrown at the deep end of the pool and having to learn how to swim. And it turns out, of course, that where you work matters less than who you immediately report to. What we also know is it takes on average a minimum of 2 years to become relatively confident and competent in our job. So if you've had a lot of turmoil and turnover in your workplace, and I invite you to think about how long those of you who are in leadership roles, or whoever your leaders are, how long have they been in a leadership role, and how did they learn to become leaders? The second one is succession planning. Succession planning refers to attracting good people, keeping them. Remember my story about the Humber College Funeral Director Program? What they were finding is that a lot of these young graduates were leaving the field after a couple of years. So that's a huge investment on your part, onboarding, orientation, and not being able to retain people. We also have, of course, the natural attrition of people who are retiring, as was expected. I always chuckle when I hear, some of you heard a few years ago, there was a lot of writing about the quote unquote great resignation that was taking place in Canada. And part of what happened there, folks, is that a lot of boomers retired exactly as was expected. They might have left slightly differently. So I should correct that. They might have left a little earlier than we had expected, maybe by a year or two. They might have been like, I'm too old for this, I'm out. Because of the impact of the stressors that were going on. But we have known since the boomers entered the world of work that they were going to be leaving. But what that's creating, of course, is generational differences in the workplace, also unprecedented rates of career mobility, where you might have to rapidly promote someone or yourself get promoted faster than you expected, because now we have to fill that gap. And how do we also retain people? And what we know, and I'll talk more about functional capacity in a minute, is that if we have a lot of new folks, we're not going to have the same level of confidence and competence as if we had a lot of very experienced people. And then finally, there's employee health and wellness, which is what I'm here to talk to you about today. The whole constellation of ways in which our well-being impacts work and how we are impacted by it, and how it also impacts how we relate to our peers and our colleagues. So let me show you this scenario. And if you're in a leadership role, or even if you're not, but if you're in a leadership role, I want to invite you to think about your immediate team now. And I'm going to use 10. We're going to pretend you have a team of 10. You might have a team of 100, 1,000. It doesn't really matter. So in this scenario, imagine that you have a team of 10 and 8 of those people are highly experienced. Remember what I said? Takes a minimum of 2 years to be reasonably competent at what you're doing. So you have 8 very experienced people and they're feeling great. They're working at 100% capacity. Now you have 2 rookies working with you. So they have under a year of experience. So obviously they're working at 50% capacity because they're new. And that's your whole constellation of work. So nobody's on sick leave. You've got 8 experienced people, 2 rookies, and your functional capacity out of a potential of 100 is 90%. Pretty good. Let's look at scenario number 2. You have 4 experienced people. Again, they're working at 100% capacity. You have 2 people who have under 2 years of experience. So see how like they have more than a year, so close to 2 years of experience. So they're now at 70% capacity because they've been doing this for, almost 2 years now. And then you have 4 rookies, right? And so again, you have nobody on stress leave here, right? Everyone's there, all the bums are in the seats, where your functional capacity has dropped to 74% because you have newbies who are there and they need time to learn and grow on the job. You're with me? I'm going to show you 2 more scenarios. Scenario number 3, we're going to stress out our experienced people. Maybe they've been going through a really stressful time in their community or at home or at work or all of it. And then you have 3 struggling folks. So they're experienced, but they've got a lot going on. Maybe they're going through a big workplace change. Maybe they're caregiving at home. Maybe they're going through a divorce, separation, what have you. You have a rookie, so they're at 50%. You have a struggling rookie. right? So you're struggling rookies only working at 30% capacity. Oh, and you got someone on sick leave. So now out of 10 potential bums in seats, you've got 9 bums in seats. So you're short one person. But because of this whole story, your functional capacity has dropped to 58%. You get the idea. The reason I'm talking about this, and I'll just show you the final scenario while I talk about this, is the reason I'm talking about this is what we found is that a lot of workplaces use as their only metric of organizational health whether people are on sick leave or the number of sick days that have been taken, or whether anyone's on short-term or long-term disability. And folks, what the research is showing is there are a lot of people who are actually the walking wounded, as we call them. They are actually at work, but they are really struggling. The other part that we don't spend enough time thinking about is how many years of experience do you folks have? You cannot expect a brand new person to work at the same level of capacity as a very experienced individual. You cannot expect someone who is going through a really complex, challenging caregiver, sandwich generation, whatever's going on in their lives, to be at the same level of capacity as someone who's not going through that. That's just the reality of work. So I do want to invite you to take a pause and think about, what do you think is the constellation? And you might not know everything that's going on with your team, but you probably can estimate the number of years that they've been in the field or at your workplace to give you a bit of a picture of your functional capacity. So I'm going to move now to working through another tool that's really our favorite tool. I call it the Venn diagram of contributing factors. You're going to see in your resources that there's a lot more on this topic that where you can spend some time kind of assessing for yourself. There's some questions you'll see that help you kind of reflect on this. In the interest of time, I'll do a brief overview of it, and then we'll propose some tools so that you can figure out ways that you can use this contributing factors Venn diagram. The way I thought about it years ago when I started kind of thinking about this concept is that it was really clear to me that burnout was not the same as secondary trauma. Secondary trauma and PTSD kind of felt the same, but there was no recognition of that. I'll talk more about that later. And then this notion of compassion fatigue or empathic strain felt really different than burnout. I felt like there was overlap for sure, but I certainly know, and as I've said earlier, you've probably all had crappy jobs at some point in your life that had nothing to do with working in the funeral profession, correct? And I certainly know that I used to work as an admin assistant in an engineering office. No trauma there. Very toxic work environment, right? So you can develop burnout without being exposed to trauma. So this is how I started kind of thinking about it. And this is why we have this Venn diagram. So just to be clear, burnout is a real thing and you can develop burnout, but it is not and should not be used as an umbrella term for everything that's happening to us in the work that we do. I find in healthcare, they use it a lot, right? You'll hear terms like physician burnout, caregiver burnout, nurse burnout. Burnout is one thing, but it's not the whole story. And I will talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So the way to think about this, and as I said, in your digital handout, you're going to have questions for each circle. So I invite you to take a pause and kind of self-assess what's going on for you. But I'm going to kind of do a brief overview of all of these. These are contributing factors. And what can happen is, as a result of these, you can develop burnout. You can develop moral distress, which I'll explain in a minute. You can develop secondary traumatic stress or PTSD, and you can develop empathic strain. Okay, so here's a way to think about it. The first one are your personal circumstances. And I don't know about you, but we've all got lives. And sometimes life is going great, and sometimes it's not. And it might be that you, as I said before, I referred to the sandwich generation. Maybe you are caring for aging elderly parents or relatives or someone else in your life. Maybe you're going through a challenging family crisis. Maybe there's someone in your family that's struggling with their own mental or physical health, or maybe you yourself are dealing with the struggles around that or around addiction or what have you. That's what's going on in your personal life. And although a lot of people say, oh, I leave home at home and I leave my personal life, behind, the reality is that, of course, it influences everything that's going on, no matter how hard we try. If I was up all night caring for a sick elderly parent, it's going to impact my productivity and my ability to be present. So I'm basically inviting you to think about, what's your story? What's going on for you right now? And in what way are those circumstances contributing to your work-related stress? The second one is work-related grief and loss. And this one's really interesting because we all know and can relate to the big G grief or the big L losses, right? And we all know that a big L loss might be obviously a tragic event. The loss of a beloved colleague, tragically, unexpectedly, something terrible that happens that has a direct impact. Our workplace, I don't know, is closed, or all of a sudden it's acquired by another company and we're disbanded, or our office is closed. I mean, there's so many ways to think about grief and loss. But what we often don't think about are the smaller L losses. So a colleague retires and you're happy for them, but they really, were a wonderful mentor, and all of a sudden they're no longer there. There's so many small L losses that we can experience as well. And I know that I've recently been asked to work with organizations that are being fused or integrated with others. We used to call it a merger, but that's not a popular word right now. But basically, let's say 3 different small funeral homes that are acquired by a larger funeral service. And that might be really positive for lots of reasons. But sometimes folks will say, I'm experiencing a sense of loss of the smallness or the small community kind of spirit that we had. And it doesn't mean that it's necessarily a negative thing, but they are still allowed to experience that loss. The third one is direct exposure to trauma. This is also where I always think it's interesting. And maybe, as I said earlier, maybe you do or you do not talk about what you do for a living when you're out in public. But I feel like a lot of civilians do not actually understand that you are sometimes called to a scene. Has that ever surprised you? Like, I always wanted to say to folks, like, who do you think does body recovery? And they're like, oh, we thought it was the firefighters or paramedics, right? So there's a notion where a lot of citizens don't really understand that you, not only obviously when you are caring for the decedent, but when you are called upon to go to a scene, that you are directly exposed to trauma. The other thing we don't talk about often enough is that you might also be still in a situation that's dangerous, right? And I don't need to explain your job to you, but if you're doing body recovery on the side of a busy highway, or you are walking in a dangerous household or dangerous neighborhood, or, there are lots of situations in which you might still be directly exposed to disturbing images, but also feel unsafe yourself. Then we're going to talk a little bit more about secondary or indirect exposure to trauma. So, and again, this is very individual. I'm not saying that everything's traumatic. I feel like that term has become overused over time, that not everything is disturbing to everyone all the time. There are certain things that you and I do for a living that no longer disturb us. And yes, we can actually go and have a sandwich after. That is completely normal. What I'm talking about here are the stories that hitch a ride with us. So let me give you a couple of examples. Stories that hitch a ride with us are stories of things that we have seen, whether it's directly or indirectly, that change certain ways that we have of being in the world. They might change certain foods that we can no longer eat. I won't slime you with details. I'm sure you can think of some. I know that working with the military, I'd have soldiers who came back from combat and they might have survived or witnessed an IED explosion. And as a result of that, there are certain foods they could never eat anymore because it's triggering. And as a result of them sharing that information with me, I could no longer eat those foods. Does that make sense? So indirect exposure, you're not there. You didn't go to the scene. Your colleague comes back and tells you all sorts of details about what they saw. And as a result, it hitches a ride with you. So there are lots of examples like that. That is known as secondary traumatic stress, also known as vicarious trauma. And those experiences are that you are being impacted by secondhand exposure. I certainly know as a clinician that there are lots of stories that clients would tell me, thousands of them, And most of the time it was fine, but once in a while, one of them would just stay with me and might even stay with me in my dreams or accompany me over the next few weeks, or make me more anxious about my children's safety because something bad had just happened. I'll give you a quick example. Just recently, very sadly, there was a tragic boating accident near where I live. Sadly, as all of you know, that often happens, May 24, May long weekend, alcohol being involved, speed, like just the worst possible thing. And just that following weekend, my son said to me, he was going to a cottage and they were boating. And I immediately could not help myself. I was like, don't do it at night, so on and so forth. That is what a lot of parents do. But because of this work, right, I cannot help myself. And I have to talk about my sense of fear of certain things that might be preventable. So that's a good example of secondary traumatic stress. As an aside, ordinary citizens can, of course, also develop secondary trauma because they also saw the news and that impacts them. But for us, we have thousands of these examples. So to illustrate this, I'm going to show you a couple of very neutral images here. And I'm going to invite you, if you have a pen, to just jot down what your first word that comes to mind. When you see this image, positive or negative, don't overanalyze it. What comes to mind when you see this picture? Don't overthink it. Okay, here's the first one. What's the first word that comes to mind for you? And here's the second one. So what I've found, I've shown these images to thousands of people across North America, and the reactions are always really interesting. So for the trampoline image, sometimes, depending on my audience, let's pretend that I'm showing this to a group of teachers. A lot of people will say, fun, good times, I have one, I want one. Once in a while, someone will say broken bones. Someone recently said loss of pelvic floor control. If you know, you know. But most people, if you're showing this to a bunch of teachers, you're probably going to have 90% of people saying fun. But if I show the same image to people who work in, orthopedics, they're going to say broken bones. And if I show this to people who work in the spinal injury clinic, they're going to say spinal injury. Does that make sense? All right. Now, when I show this image to ordinary citizens, people will say open road, freedom, I have one, I want one. A small percentage, sadly, might say something terrible because maybe they experienced or lost someone in a motorcycle accident. But I suspect that if I show this to a group of funeral directors, I'm going to have a disproportionate amount of people who are going to say donor cycle, accident waiting to happen, even if you own one yourself. Does that make sense? So these are just two examples, but basically they're just pictures. But our work and our experiences change our view of the world. And that's not necessarily good or bad. What we need to find is that when we are so steeped in exposure to death and to pain and suffering, are we able to still have a sense that the world is safe in any way? And if we start finding and that this is really interfering with our functioning, our thinking, our sleep, we're needing to numb out at night because we can't fall asleep because we are haunted by these images. If we have children in our lives, that we're preventing them from doing anything because we are so consumed by fear about trauma, that potentially may be signs of post-traumatic stress. I'm not necessarily saying you have PTSD, but they can be signs of post-traumatic stress. And in those instances, I really encourage you to seek some help and have a chance to speak to a qualified mental health practitioner so that they can provide you some strategies and tools so that you don't have to deal with this by yourself. So the research has shown, and I'm smiling because honestly, I did an entire talk called It's Not Just Burnout, which I won't bore you with today, but here's what the research has shown. Burnout and secondary traumatic stress are separate, parallel phenomena. One does not lead to another, but you absolutely can have both. Burnout is related to your working conditions, and I'm going to talk about that in a couple of minutes. Some recent research from my colleague, Dr. Ginny Sprang, and others started investigating the difference between professionals in our field who have no trauma symptoms whatsoever, people who have full-blown post-traumatic stress disorder, and folks in the middle. Now, some of you may already know this, but not everyone who experiences trauma develops PTSD. right? In the general population, it varies, but basically about 7 to 10% of people who've experienced trauma will develop PTSD. Sadly, that data is higher for women than for men. In law enforcement, we know that about 10 to 15% of law enforcement are at risk of developing PTSD as a result of their work. But what's interesting is some of our studies are showing that some of us, that includes you and me, are kind of falling just below the radar. So let's take a look at this. So some people have no trauma symptoms whatsoever. Some people have some trauma symptoms, but their day-to-day functioning is not impaired, right? They're functioning just fine. A lot of us, though, and what the study found is 25% of folks in trauma-exposed professions, we have some trauma symptoms. We are functionally impaired. I'll explain what that looks like in a minute, but we actually fall just under the radar of PTSD. What does that mean? That means that we deserve help, but it means also that it might be hard to get workers' compensation or any type of recognition in terms of long-term disability or short-term disability or sick leave, because we're found to be basically just below the threshold, but we still deserve help. And what we find is that the sooner we address it, the more we can catch it early and prevent it from becoming full-blown PTSD. So I've been talking about functional impairment. I want to talk briefly about what that looks like, and you'll see it's very intuitive. My colleague Brian Bride developed a functional impairment screening tool, and he was particularly looking at folks who have a lot of secondary trauma exposure. So you have both, of course, in your profession. But basically, functional impairment is a way in which we see a negative change in our functioning as a result of trauma exposure. And this free test helps you basically rate your own level to assess ways in which your work has impacted your functioning. And it assesses it in 7 different realms. And it might be, what's going on for you socially. Remember earlier I talked about some people, we isolate more, or we don't want to spend time with other people who are not in the field, or we stop avoiding social events, so on and so forth. How it's impacting your functioning at work, your family functioning, sexual functioning. I find it really interesting that even though you and I work in very high trauma work environments that often involve, well, hopefully not often, but that sometimes involve sexual assault, sexual violence, terrible things that have been done to people, we very rarely have a conversation about how that affects our ability to have any relationship with intimacy. We don't talk about that, right? Your psychological functioning, your emotional functioning, and your physical functioning. So I invite you to go and take this screener and see how you rank, and see, is there an area where you are particularly concerned at this time? And again, this is where seeking the help of a qualified practitioner is really important. And I'll recommend some resources at the end for resources that are available specifically in Alberta. Okay, so we're just wrapping up our Venn diagram here. The next one after direct and indirect trauma are challenges of the system. Now, I have a scientific term for system challenges, which I'm sure you'll understand. System challenges are things where there's rules, regulations, laws, procedures where you feel incredibly frustrated and your reaction is, this is BS. Do you know what I mean? Like, these are not things you agree with. These are things that are red tape, navigating convoluted systems. I remember recently working with a group of funeral directors who talked about, I know it's different in every province, but they were having trouble basically working with situations where individuals had died, but they did not have any type of social assistance, but they were not eligible for any type of funding. So these people would fall through the cracks, all sorts of situations where we basically feel like the rules and regulations of the system are preventing us from doing our work in the way that we think is ethical and right. And I'm sure that you have lots of opinions about that in terms of individuals' remains, family practices, people wanting to say goodbye to their loved one in a way that you think is perfectly fine, but maybe that's not what's allowed. I mean, there's so many good conversations we could have about that. What happens as a result of some of those, particularly when you're working with individuals who, were below the poverty line, or were really folks who had become incredibly marginalized by society, you can have a lot of moral distress. And moral distress comes from healthcare, and it refers to inconsistencies between your beliefs about what should be done and what you are allowed to do. So a perfect example of that from nurses is this cartoon that says basically, oh yeah, so moral distress happens when we know what the right thing to do is, but we can't act on it. And this cartoon I love, where basically they say, this is a discharge nurse. She'll be able to tell you about all the services you can't get anymore when you leave. Kind of summarizes it really well. Okay, the last two circles of the Venn diagram, one of them is your working conditions. And folks, this is the one that can cause burnout. Your hours, your pay, your rewards, your recognition, who you immediately report to, your workload, compensation, lack of flexible schedule, the quality of relationships between supervisors and peers. This is where burnout lives. What the research has found is that burnout is a result of a mismatch between what you need and want and what your job is able to provide you. Compensation is only one piece of the story. I'm sure that you know some folks who had incredibly high-paying jobs, but they were absolutely miserable. Money is only one part of the story. The final circle is the social cultural context. And what that refers to are ways in which what's going on in our communities or geopolitically might be directly impacting you, or certainly colleagues and folks that work with you. So if you yourself are a member of an underrepresented and or marginalized community, there might be a current crisis or cultural shift that's going on in society that is having a direct impact on you. It might also be that you end up being asked to do things outside of your scope of work because of your race, language, or identity. I was recently working in the United States where there was a staff member who was the only Spanish-speaking person in the workplace, and she ended up being the translator for every single client that was coming in that only spoke Spanish. But as we all know, a translator is a profession. Like that's a job, right? That is actually a full-blown profession, being a translator and an interpreter. And this person was being asked to do that on top of their existing work. It could also be a lack of representation. I was recently in a community where there was an individual who was hired who was the only person of color in that workplace. And there was a point where they talked about, you don't need to put me on every poster and every flyer. Maybe you should actually hire more diverse population instead of me being like the token person in that workplace. So social cultural context has a huge influence. And as we know, as a result of the pandemic and all sorts of things that are going on the geopolitical scale, we can't always separate out what's going on in society and how we are being impacted or our staff are being impacted by what's going on. So the Venn diagram, all of those factors can be hugely amplified by fatigue, strain, wear and tear, but also by change and uncertainty. So I want to invite you to take a minute now and think about of the different circles in the Venn diagram that I discussed, which ones are areas of strength for you and which ones are areas of concern. And again, you can go to your digital workbook and spend a couple of minutes reflecting on that. I now want to invite you to think about your warning signs and how do you learn to identify when you're headed for trouble. And what I often say, folks, is that if you're not sure, ask your loved ones. They will be delighted to tell you. So the way I like to think about it, and there's lots of different continuums. I kind of think about, green, yellow, red, or green, yellow, mango colored, and red. But it's really starting to think about, how do I know I'm headed for trouble? And the Mental Health Commission of Canada created a version that I really liked. This was modified by the National Fallen Firefighters Foundation in the US, but I like this one in particular because it starts really thinking about, like, not just, I can't survive this. Obviously, this workshop is not designed for people in the red zone. If you're in the red zone, this workshop ain't going to cut it. Make sense? But when you start moving to something isn't right, I really like that column where what I want to invite us all to do is start noticing what are our warning signs early on. How do we start knowing that something isn't right so that we don't get to the place of I can't keep this up or I can't survive this. So what are your warning signs? One of my favorite warning signs I call the must be nice phenomena. And this might sound a little facetious, but to me, it's an incredibly reliable warning sign. And it is basically when I start feeling emotions of jealousy or judgment towards other people or doing activities that I wish I could do. I often see this on social media, for example, I don't know, or maybe in your workplace. Have you ever had a colleague who said, oh, I just paid off my mortgage, and you're like, oh, must be nice. So instead of being happy for them, you feel resentment or angry or even jealous. Or I remember at some point at the very start of the pandemic when we were all locked up in Ontario, and we're in lockdown mode, and a colleague of mine posted like a 5,000 burpee challenge. And if you don't know what a burpee is, it's horrible. It's a form of exercise that some of you, maybe you love it, and she posted a 5,000 burpee challenge. And I was not taking very good care of myself that week. It was a very stressful week. I was kind of juggling everything because we had just gone into lockdown, trying to take care of everybody. And I'm embarrassed to tell you, I was watching Tiger King. If you've never seen it, don't. I'm embarrassed to tell you, I was basically just not coping great that week, not exercising, working too much, watching terrible Netflix and so on. And instead of feeling like, oh, go do the 5,000 burpee challenge, good for you, I felt like judgment or angry towards her. I was like, oh, must be nice to have time to do that. I'm trying to save lives here, So joking aside, though, that reactivity is always about something we crave. Think about it for a minute. I bet you that you have colleagues and friends who do some self-care activities you have no interest in doing ever. Some of you never want to run, correct? You see runners and you're like, knock yourself out. No interest. Must be nice only happens when there are things that we crave or that we want. And what I know is that when I'm doing the basic things that I need to do, I don't feel mad about the 5,000 burpee challenge. I see my friend and I go, good for you. It doesn't push those buttons in the same way. So you can think of your warning signs in a variety of ways. What I like to do is to think about them as physical, and we all know what that might look like. And often we have the same physical warning signs over and over again. I'm sure you have a special body part that lets you know you're headed for trouble. And what we often do is we ignore or we medicate, correct? It might be behavioral warning signs. Again, those might be very individual. For some people, it might be that they're drinking too much alcohol. For some people, that they're comfort eating instead of eating for nutrition, and they know that that's when they're really feeling close to the red zone. Or it might be that you're doom scrolling on your phone, or you're watching 7 hours of Netflix till the sign comes up that says, are you still there? What are your behavioral signs? And finally, your emotional signs. Is it that you're quick to anger, more irritable, or you tend to numb out? And again, ask your loved ones, what are the warning signs that they see? And what I like to invite you to do is to first think about, like, what is your number one warning sign? Is it physical? Is it behavioral? Is it emotional? Or are you not sure? Answers will vary. I have a friend who's extremely somatic. What that means is that her symptoms of stress really show up in a physical way before anything else. And for me personally, I know that it's much more emotional. I tend to be more irritable. And I will sometimes at home, people will tell me, that I have a shorter wick. And that's my first warning sign. So what are your big three? And it might be, folks, that all your warning signs are physical. Maybe they're all behavioral. Maybe it's a combination. But what are your big three? And more importantly, what do you need? What do you need from your loved ones? What do you need from your colleagues when you're experiencing these warning signs? I know I used to have this awesome neighbor. She passed away recently. She was 107. Little white gloves, little hat. Who would not want to hang out with that wonderful woman? She was charming. And I know because when I was in the green zone, I'd go and hang out with her. Her name was Margaret. When I was getting close to the yellow zone, I would start, avoiding her or running into my house because I could still walk faster than her, And when I started finding myself taking the recycling under the cover of darkness, in order to ensure that I wouldn't see her, I knew that that was my barometer. So here's an exercise I invite you to do. So first of all, at home. And when I say home, you might live by yourself, but hopefully you have some significant people in your life. So however you define your constellation of home. Number one, how should they recognize? Like, how would they know that you're in the yellow zone? What does that look like? But even more importantly, what do you need? What do you need? Do you need to be left alone for half an hour? You need someone to give you a hug? You need someone to not talk to you? You need someone to make you dinner? Like, what do you need? How can they help? And even more important, at work. How do your colleagues know? If you're new to a workplace or you've just hired some new staff, it's really good to have that conversation. I remember years ago, I had a wonderful supervisor. His name was Mike. And he said to me, it's very funny, actually. When I first met him, he said, he didn't use the word RBF, which some of you know, the resting bee face, you know what I'm talking about? But he basically said to me, I have an RBF. My face at rest looks like I'm angry, which I'm now thinking is so cute and funny. This is a long time ago. And he said, so I kind of look like I'm mad, but I'm not. It's just my face. And it was a really good thing to talk about at first, because when you're new, you might start thinking, oh my goodness, like, is he mad at me or what have you? What he also said is, he said, when I'm stressed, you're going to hear me. I'm going to walk down the halls and I'm going to whistle. And I sound cheerful, but I'm actually stressed. They're small things, but they allowed us to have this good conversation. And I could talk to him also about, like, hey, when I'm stressed, this is what I look like, and this is what I need. Prevent a lot of miscommunication and conflict. As we're wrapping up, I want to talk about a couple of brief strategies that you can use to help support your colleagues. You're going to see that in the toolkit, we provide a lot more on this strategy, but I did want to mention them before we finish. And one of our favorite tools is called a hot walk and talk. And this is particularly suited for if you have a colleague who's feeling very overwhelmed, or perhaps they're even having what looks like an anxiety attack, or like they've just had a really difficult call. They are out of their window, right? Like, they're not doing particularly well. They're not having a full-blown psychotic episode. And I'm not saying that facetiously. Like, obviously there are situations where someone is truly unwell and you need to access proper resources that they need and they deserve. I'm talking about people who are clearly feeling dysregulated and they need some immediate support. Does that make sense? So our favorite strategy is the hot walk and talk. And the hot refers to noticing that we or the person is activated, right? They are not well, they're shaking, they're agitated, or they just came to you and said, I had a really difficult situation. And what you're going to invite them to do is you're going to, first of all, move them away from wherever the thing happened. And you're going to offer to walk with them around the block. You can do this on the phone, by the way, also, if they're not with you. And you're going to offer them a drink of water. Now, why do I say a drink of water? I'm going to take a drink of water right now. What we have known is that what water does, as some of you remember, your adrenal glands live right above your kidneys, correct? And what you know is that when people are experiencing a lot of stress, they have an excess amount of stress hormones, including cortisol. And what we know, of course, those are being produced by your adrenal glands. And when you drink water, it's going to help you flush out those stress hormones. So does exercise. So your hot walk and talk, you're inviting the person to drink some water. You're going to invite them to walk around the block at a brisk pace, and then talk. You're going to invite them to tell you what's going on. And what we know is that by doing that, you are providing what is called psychological first aid. You're normalizing what's going on with them. You're getting them to get it out there. And you're also encouraging them to just receive the support and validation that they need. Sometimes, folks, that's actually enough. And you'll find that people can fairly quickly reintegrate, feeling well because they've had a chance to do that. Now, there are times where people need a little bit more than that. And this is where psychological first aid in a formal way comes in. You can read more about psychological first aid in your resources. The Canadian Red Cross offers a very easy to access basic course on PFA, which is the acronym for it. There's some wonderful resources. Again, it's okay to go in different fields and find resources that are not specific to the funeral industry. If you go to the child advocacy or the child abuse world, you're going to find very well-suited resources for you, including one that I was involved in advising on last year called the PFA Guide for Child Advocacy Center Supervisors. And you can read more about it, but basically know that PFA was originally developed for natural disasters and terrorism. And it was a way to think about, we know how to do first aid. How do we provide psychological first aid? And first aid, psychological first aid is not a checklist. It's not something where I'm going to show you in a minute, like there are lots of different steps, but it is a common sense model. And basically what we're assuming is that people who've experienced a psychologically, potentially traumatic event, what they often just need is a human being to be there and to listen and to provide them with some reassurance and to normalize what's been going on. So, as I said, there are lots of models out there of psychological first aid. They're all free. And basically, it's not a new intervention. It's just a way of conceptualizing how do we sensibly care for other human beings the way that we would probably do it anyways. So it's a collection of helpful strategies and suggestions. It's not a step-by-step process where you're like, oh, the 8 actions of PFA. And I'm saying that because there is a mobile app that you can download from the National Center for PTSD, which is fine. But what I've sometimes seen, for example, with paramedics, is that they're looking at their app and they're like, make contact and engage, offer safety and like, it's not a step-by-step. It is really just the idea of if someone is distraught and they've just experienced something, distressing, making contact, offering them comfort, whether that's a glass of water or a snack, listening to them, and then linking them to the right resources. That's PFA. I'm going to finish by offering you a couple of our favorite strategies to reset ourselves. As I said, there's far more that's available in the toolkit. They're all 2 to 3 minutes, but just wanted to share my favorite ones with you. And then finally, a quick exercise that you can do to kind of make an action plan for this as a result of listening to this. So this image, and I know it's not very high quality, but I love it. And it was sent to me years ago by the Los Angeles police. And it says, come on, inner peace. I don't have all day. And I think it's apt because a lot of us who work in these high trauma, high stress fields have a short attention span. We like action. And if I were to say to you right now, spend 40 minutes sitting on a couch or a pillow, you're probably not going to do it. I'm not going to do it either. I tend to be a little hyperactive and high energy. So I'm not going to tell you to do that. What we can do, though, is a 3-minute breathing space activity. So this is really simple. And there's a printable postcard you can download if you're interested on our toolkit. And it's so easy. And you can use it at the start of your day, in the middle of your day, or at the end of the day, before or after a challenging call. And the first minute is to simply notice any sounds that you hear around you. The second minute is to notice any body sensations. The chair on your back, for me, the glasses on my nose, my feet on the ground, without changing anything. And the third minute is to notice your breath without changing it. Just notice it. And that's it. That's the 3-minute breathing space. Now, some folks have said to me, I'm too busy for that. And I'm going to respectfully say to you that I have offered this strategy to 911 communicators for the Ontario Provincial Police, and they're doing it. So if 911 comms have time, I think we do too. And again, remember what I said earlier. We do these several weeks in a row. They become learned responses. And what I know is when I'm having trouble sleeping at night, I will visualize this postcard. I'll listen to sounds around me, and I'll immediately fall asleep again. Resetting through pause. So this is our cat that I mentioned to you at the start, Gary, the COVID kitten. And what we know is that so much reactivity is what's happening right now. I don't know if you're still on social media. Everyone is yelling at each other. No one is listening. So I'm inviting you to consider, what does pausing look like, even if it's a minute or 30 seconds before we respond and react to communications or to people in front of us. Remember the loving kindness meditation. May you be well, may you be safe, may you be loved. Do you have a way to arrive at work? Do you have a way to arrive at home when you're done with your workday, even if you're on call? Do you have activities to set up your day? How do you start your day? We often talk about morning resources. What I found is, although I like to be informed, if I start my day before I even get out of bed by watching the news, it has a huge impact on what I call my morning resources. It can really set the tone for my entire day. So for me, doom scrolling is something that I've stopped doing. I'm well informed, but I don't have notifications telling me about everything that's going on all the time. And how do you end your day? For those of you who are funeral directors, I suspect you don't spend the whole evening in your black suit, correct? At least I hope not. Why not? And it's not just because, maybe it's been exposed to stuff. It's actually also letting your brain know that you're shifting gears from work to home. Do you have other rituals to let your brain know that you're switching gears? And they can be anything. They're very individual practices, but we know that it cues our brain to know, oh, I've made a cup of tea. It's a special tea that I only have at this certain time, or I've put on this special song, or I fired up my barbecue, or whatever. The final activity I'm going to invite you to do is called the balance map. And I want to make it clear that I do not believe that we ever achieve optimal balance, right? It's not like somehow we get there. It's much more like, this is a very Canadian example, but I always think about those, when you go to a cottage or a lake, and there's these, rafts that are all like independent squares that are all kind of stuck together. You know what I'm talking about. And it's more like that we're always constantly trying to achieve some type of balance within maybe even just our day, as opposed to our entire career. Now, this balance map is mine. Yours might look totally different. And so you're going to see in your handout that you can fill yours out. But what's interesting is I know this is the right one for me because I haven't had to change a single thing in 15 years. They are still the things that help me stay well while doing this high trauma, high stress work. So the way I think about it is the following. The ones at the very top are the most important for me, just fundamentally for me to be able to continue doing this work. When I talk about physical health, it doesn't mean that I need to do anything fancy. I don't run marathons. I don't, go away to like on weeks of vacation. What I need is good sleep. I don't need a ton of sleep, but I need a good night's sleep in order to feel like I can deal with anything else. For some other people, that's physical exercise. My partner needs exercise more than he needs sleep. That's his number one thing that helps widen his window and be in the zone and be well. Does that make sense? For some of you, it's something else. It might be that you need food and you get hangry. So what's your number one thing that helps you feel well physically? Simplifying. This isn't everyone's, but for me, so as I'm recording this, I'm about to go on another work trip tomorrow. And what I know is that because I travel a lot for work, I wear the same things all the time. So I'm not sitting there going, oh my goodness, how am I going to pack? I wear the same thing. If you meet me, I have 2 shirts, I have 2 pairs of pants. I just wear them all the time. That might be really sad and depressing to someone. For me, I don't care. It's my uniform. My life is simpler that way. That's mine. You might have something else. Stress relief. What does that look like? Again, as I said earlier, what is the difference between watching a really fun show for half an hour and 45 minutes and watching 5 hours and feeling really not that well rested? What does stress relief really look like for you? The next one is understanding how I react to change. It might not be true for you, but I had a lot of uncertainty and unpleasant surprises when I was growing up. And I don't like surprises or change, even when they're positive. I know that about myself. So I know that if you were my boss and you were to innocently send me an email, at Friday at 5 o'clock as you're wrapping up your week, and if you were to say to me, oh, could we meet Monday morning, have a good weekend? I would spend the weekend thinking I'm getting fired or I'm in trouble. And you might be like, oh, I was just going to talk about whatever, the staff picnic, and I just cleared my deck for the weekend. So understanding that about myself has been really helpful. Understanding what you need in terms of social and emotional supports. Some of us are introverts. We refuel through time alone. Some of us are extroverts and we refuel through time with others. Being able to know that and being able to carve out that space. Thinking about what is an interesting job, but also what is a hobby. Now, I'm saying this, folks, because I have met some people who work in high trauma exposed environments who have told me that their hobby was, quote unquote, hobby, was volunteering at a women's shelter or a food bank. Volunteering at a food bank is giving back. It is not a hobby. If you work in a trauma exposed profession, your hobby should be something that has nothing to do with pain or suffering. Does that make sense? Hobby would be gardening, hunting, fishing, exercising, the arts, playing music. A women's shelter or a food bank is not a hobby. respectfully. Finally, trauma stewardship. This is taken from a book of the same title by Laura van der Noot-Lipsky. It's in your resources. In my opinion, it's the best book out there about managing secondary traumatic stress. It's full of great resources and New Yorker cartoons. So I encourage you to learn more about that if you're found that secondary trauma was the #1 factor that really resonated with you today. Finally, managing occupational stress and resentment. How do we make daily decisions about the limits of what our workplace can offer us, whether it's still the right place for us? Is it a good fit? And finally, thinking of different ways that we can give back that don't necessarily require more of our time. Are there ways to give back to our community without necessarily working even harder? That might be simply giving back at work by mentoring a brand new hire and providing them support as they learn to navigate this work. It doesn't have to be extra hours, if that makes sense. So I'm going to leave you with this. What is one thing you can change right now, even by 1% of one of these, that could be a slight improvement to how things are going for you right now in terms of your balancement? So I promised you I was going to mention resources. So Alberta Health Services has a website that helps you navigate access to resources. So you're going to see when you go to their website, there's an addiction helpline, there's a mental health helpline. There are a whole bunch of wonderful resources that help you put you in touch with people that are perhaps local if you're looking for mental health resources. I just want to invite you to also remember that as a result of the pandemic, a lot of mental health professionals, not all, but a lot of them in private practice are also offering Zoom or virtual-based counseling. So usually the catchment area is the province. So for example, in Ontario, I'm licensed to provide work or services to the entire province. So you wouldn't necessarily need to live near me to seek counseling if I were in private practice. Does that make sense? So I know that Zoom-based therapy is not for everyone, but don't knock it till you've tried it. If you live in a rural area and you want to have access to mental health counseling, there are all sorts of resources, including mental health online sessions. So check out what Alberta Health Services has to offer. Key takeaways. Remember what I started with talking about the Kingston Penitentiary and folks who had worked there for a long time who engaged in career-sustaining behaviors. Reflect on the messages that you've received when you were growing up from whoever raised you. Identify your contributing factors, develop tools to recalibrate, seek help when you need it, and make a plan. Folks, I hope this was useful to you. As I mentioned, there are lots of additional free resources you can access, and I hope that this will help you map out wherever you are in your journey as a funeral professional. How can you stay well so that you can remain present to yourself, your loved ones, your colleagues, and the folks who turn to us in their greatest moment of need. Thank you for what you do. Take care.